thank Dr. Ibis Carrion for her leadership in at the ATTC. This is a very special time for me. I'm actually co-presenting with one of my favorite people. So thank you, Wendy, for co-presenting with me. And I'm gonna go over some of the objectives for the presentation. We would love for you to, after this presentation, to hopefully you will increase understanding on the importance of collaborating and co-developing training with direct participation of community organizations and their members. We also would like for you to describe and become familiar with the impact of the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, and mental health in the Latinx or Latino children and families. And we definitely believe that self-care is so important in all the work that we do, so we will discuss that also. And throughout the presentation, what you are gonna get is how we're weaving in our story on how 3 Latino women agree to work in collaboration, and how our project unfolded, and how we believe that it can be a model or a foundation framework that hopefully you are inspired to also use. Before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to mention, I come, as you know, from the introduction, I come from academic setting. I work at University of Connecticut, and I'm part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I am the co-director of 2 centers from that network, and my main role has been, and I consider myself very fortunate, to reach out to grassroots organizations and provide information that the network produces at a very high rate in terms of curricula, in terms of trainings, in terms of product developments, fact sheets, and all the products that the NCTSN develops are based on developmental trauma, complex trauma, and how it affects individuals, how it affects families and communities, and what different approaches that we can take. So my interest, when I met Paloma Mayona, who is not actually here with us presenting, from NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, when I met her and I met Wendy, who you will hear from her a little bit later, from the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence at the time, we sort of had a lot of things in common. Both of them were directors of training and diversity in their own grassroots organizations, and I had tons of information to share from the network and also from my university. And we had so many things in common in terms of our passion to serve our Latino communities and other marginalized communities, and one common ground that we had, and it made our professional and personal relationship stronger, was the fact that we all believe that our work was very much connected with social justice. And when we sort of confirmed that this was our goal, there were a lot of things that were easier to do. And I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move my one of the screens here, but I won't be able to, so that's fine. All right, so and we understand that marginalized populations who face a lot of different challenges. They do face those challenges in their homes and also in their communities, and as part of institutional racism, right? We also know, and this is very well, I think that it will resonate with the audience, before the pandemic and now, we know that Latinos are disproportionately affected by food insecurity, by unemployment, and by other sort of factors that are really affecting their overall well-being. and we also have statistics that show that, right? Hispanics are also overrepresented among the poor. And here are some statistics that prove this. One of the pieces that is highly concerning is obviously the high rate of poverty that the Latino children are enduring now, right? And adolescents and families and children living in urban communities, we know that they are actually more affected by poverty, by crime, by drug-related activities, and these oftentimes increase the risk for violence exposure, victimization, including homicides, assaults, and physical altercations. So just briefly talking about, we know that Latinos are becoming the majority of the minority group, and we knew this before COVID-19, and we know that now. We are in need of cultural and competence training and also services that can begin hearing our needs and fostering our dreams. And as providers in our different settings, we all, Wendy, Paloma, and I, we really observed and witnessed the big gaps that existed then and unfortunately continue existing even now due to many factors that influence the way that Latinos receive and seek mental health services, including services for trauma and domestic violence. So we had a lot that we wanted to work towards, and we understood, from my colleagues, from Paloma and Wendy, both working with grassroots organizations, they taught me a lot about the importance of effective advocacy and why this was really meaningful in order to build healthy relationships based on trust with Latinos. And why it was so important to believe in the strength of every woman, every man that we served within the context of their family and their communities, right? So in the importance of appreciating deeply the Latino cultures, that there are really different subcultures of Latinx, right? Their histories, our religions, and also the history of oppression and how this continues being a factor, right? We also wanted to support the decision of the consumers or clients, even when those decisions are somewhat conflicted with ours, and understanding that these decisions are often based on cultural norms and practices, and also based on their own realities, right? There is something that, taking classes at the Coalition of Domestic Violence and taking their trainings that have really amazing ones. Something that truly resonates with me and now I incorporated in my practice is that many times we don't have to believe everything that the victims are telling us, but we need to accept it and we need to work with them in their own journey and help them to meet the goals that they are setting in a very respectful way. And the importance also to become a very effective advocate is the importance of being knowledgeable about Latino resources in your own communities, right? This will help our clients, our consumers to navigate the mainstream system that can be very cumbersome, and also to learn how to navigate non-traditional resources. So other ways that we conduct effective advocacy have to be based on respeto, right? Our communities have been highly marginalized and oppressed. So building relationship on respect help us to gain and earn their trust. And if important is also, and if it is also doable, it would be really important to meet a few of their family members. That many times really resonates well with the Latino culture. We really are like, we have a collectivistic view of relating to the world. So it's mostly about the group than the individual, and getting to know some key family members really can help with the outcomes of the services that you would like to provide. And the connection that we do is a little bit more it's a little bit different, I would say, right? Like Latinos, we are very good storytellers. We love to chat. We love the warmth. You know, we are very touchy. And you know, right now, that's a little bit difficult for us not to be close to one another. But it's also very important to realize that that's how we are formed, and that's the way that we know best how to relate. And whenever you can devote a little extra time learning a few things that might not be so much related to the service that you're providing, that can really earn a little bit more of the trust of your client and also make them feel comfortable. So, you know, we had a lot of different curricula that each of us were using, and they were very meaningful and they were very helpful. But one of the gaps that, as I mentioned before, it was that, you know, there were some elements of the Latino culture that were missing into the trainings that we provided at the time. And the big task for the three of us was, you know, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to make sure that whatever we deliver as trainings to our community could resonate with them and could really be in a language that they could understand and in the cultural frame that they are familiar with, right? So these are three of the curriculums that we didn't necessarily took everything from it, but we used as reference to make sure that we align with what we wanted to do. And coming from our three different ways of educating our community, Paloma from NAMI educating about mental illness and trying to really eliminate the stigma that many Latinos continue having about mental illness. I was pretty much focused and continue being focused on trauma-informed services and trauma treatments, right? And Wendy at the time with the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, but now as a professional consultant, continues advocating her career on issues of domestic violence and has many different trainings that speak to that, right? So taking these three curriculums mentioned in the slide as a point of reference, we began adapting and weaving in about how there was an intersection between domestic violence, trauma, and mental health in Latino families and children, that we were seeing it not only, you know, in our professional sort of offices and in the way that we were relating, but also we were actually witnessing in our communities. And that was the important piece for us. And we understood that each of us has something to give that was really unique, and that that what we were doing in isolation, if we would come together, there were a lot of things that were overlapping, and we could really teach one another, learn from one another, and empower more people to do the same and disseminate by educating more members of our communities. We would be able to reach out more people that that can use this type of information. And that's what we did. And to give you an example of how we started shaping it is that with my curriculum, the one that I also love and really appreciate all the different benefits that this curriculum offers. It's called Think Trauma. It's available for free in the NCTSN network and the website. You can also become a trainer if that's what you would like. And there are different trainees that go on. I have trained a good number of people in Puerto Rico, but I do trainings also around the United States. This Think Trauma curriculum trains people to become trainers, as I said, and that's really important because we cannot do the work by ourselves. There are a lot of people that need to be reached, and the more that we can empower others, the more that this helpful information can be distributed and can be disseminated in different communities. And I really hope that this is the case. Now, with the Think Trauma curriculum, it had 4 modules. It is very informative. It gives you a lot of different tools that you can utilize. And one of them is it teaches you about the ACE study. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ACE study, and I just want to go very quickly about this. So the adverse childhood experiences and maladaptive coping strategies was actually a study that was conducted by Dr. Feliri and Dr. Anda. There were 10 questions that they were asked to more than 17,000 people. And these questions were about adverse childhood experiences, and all of them started by asking before the age of 18. Before the age of 18, were you sexually abused? Before the age of 18 were you physically abused? Yes or no? Before the age of 18, were you separated by from your caregiver or one of your parents? They also wanted to know if one of the parents or caregivers had a mental illness, went to prison, had a substance abuse issue, whether or not was domestic violence involved before the age of 18 in their household. So those are the type of questions that they asked. And they asked to this big number of people, all adults, that they wanted, and mostly from middle class social status and mostly Caucasians. Okay, and these questions really were very helpful for us to understand, confirm what many researchers or clinicians already knew about about how adverse childhood experiences affect the, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go this. Okay, I was trying to do something else. Okay, so it confirmed that there were significant findings. The adults who presented significant chronic medical conditions and significant psychological conditions, they endorse a lot of substance abuse or substance use in their households when they were children, and you have the percentages there: parental separation, mental illness of a caregiver, battered mother, and criminal behavior of one of the parents. Okay. Now, the other thing that was interesting was that further analysis showed that the more ACE scores that were endorsed, the more risk behaviors that people were engaging in. So, so that was really remarkable to see how what what adverse childhood experiences were, how it was impacting their long lifespan to experiences that they had before the age of 18. It was impacting their adulthood right now, right? So they presented negative coping mechanisms were very active at the time that people were answering the questions. All right, so now the other thing that they realized was that the more childhood experiences that were endorsed, the more high-risk behavior that people were engaging in, the more disease and disability and social problems that were experienced, and ultimately, these were the people whose lifespans were cut short by 20 years. When compared with their peers. So all of this was very significant, continue being very significant now, right? But now I understood that there were gaps in the realities of Latinos. And these are the things that we incorporated in the training that we were conducting and that we co-developed. And these are some examples. So the ACE study, did not take into consideration experiences of immigration or migration, which is very important to take into consideration when we're working with Latino populations, right? Circular migration is something that very unique that Puerto Ricans might be experiencing. They are American citizens, so they do, they can go from the island to the mainland or the mainland to the island. Yeah, oftentimes when that happens and it happens repetitively, that's what is called circular migration. And sometimes for kids, that can be an adverse childhood experience. And the same thing for immigration status and also the ways that maybe a family immigrates and what it means and how it affects the life of a child. So those are things that we need to take into consideration. Social isolation is very much related with domestic violence, and that's something that we need to also pay attention to. The experiences of racial discrimination, historical accounts of oppressions, health disparities is something that right now we sort of noticing it more, but this is something that we have experienced even before the pandemic, right? Social inequities, and also now, the experience of COVID-19 has to be addressed not just by Latinos, but also by other populations. And that this is something that, we all need to be very aware of. In a few years, we will know what are really the effects of it. So the other considerations for how we develop the curriculum and why we wanted to educate people and empower them to consider when there is an intersection between domestic violence, trauma, and mental health is the different levels of acculturation of a family. So, many times this is very important. We have heard many times, children being acculturated much faster than their parents, and the many experiences of role reversals, not only in the parents and children dynamics, but also in the couple's relationship, right? Oftentimes, women are the ones that become the financial providers for their household, and this is the first time after they migrated or immigrated to the mainland, to the United States, and that creates a lot of conflicts and actually has many different dynamics that families have to encounter. We still, Latinos, deal with a lot of mental health stigma. The way that domestic violence is experienced with shame and blame, blaming the victim, is also important to weave into a curriculum. I already mentioned a little bit about the gender role expectations about machismo versus marianismo and how it plays a big role in the type of relationship that continues attempting to be built in a new environment and under different conditions, and oftentimes with role reversals. Many times the limited language proficiency and the disparities in economic and social resources are important to include. And now Wendy will tell us more about the contextual factors of domestic violence among Latinos.
Thank you, Rocio, and thank you, Isa, Cindy, and everyone for this wonderful opportunity. It's such a pleasure to be here, and Rocio, you're one of my favorite people too, so this is great that we're getting to work together after so many years to talk about something that we created and was so important when we created it and continues to be important as well. So as Rocio was talking, and I was remembering kind of like the beginning stages of putting this curriculum together. As Rocio said, the three of us were coming from different organizations, but nonetheless mainstream organizations. And just as we were three Spanish-speaking Latinas and had varied experiences, we very quickly realized that there wasn't something created that spoke specifically to Spanish-speaking Latino families that our agencies were servicing. And so if we continue to carry that thread, we also realize that folks had knowledge of domestic violence, or basic knowledge of domestic violence, basic mental health and trauma information, but really it wasn't organized, at least in our experience, in a way that really informed professionals about some of the very specific factors that we had experienced work well when you're working with Latino and Spanish-speaking families. And so for us, it was like, well, yes, at the time I worked in Connecticut, and as Rocio said, of course, there were professionals doing great work and organizations doing great work around domestic violence. But another important factor for us when we started really kind of unpacking what that looked like in our experience, right, was that domestic violence, so that professionals needed to continue to engage conversation and exploring the fact that domestic violence does occur in the context of the family's daily life, and that there were personal factors, but there were also systemic factors that came into play. And so a lot of the families that we were working with had already been experiencing oppression, systemic racism. As Rocio said, some were immigrants coming from other countries and had different levels of assimilation or acculturation in the country. And so for us, it was very important to kind of lift some of these factors as we continue to expand this conversation. Of course, there were cultural values in our experience that really stood out for us. And so really thinking about the importance of family, religion, communities, and then gender expectations, and how did that play a role in us shaping this curriculum and really shaping this conversation across a couple of states and at least almost a couple hundred professionals that we trained. And so we continue to really think about intersectionality and how folks that were experiencing trauma didn't have one identity or one thing that defined them, for lack of a better term, right? And so we continue to think about messaging the fact that for us and in our professional experience, it was about intersectionality and really thinking about the complexities and the multi-layered ways that people lived, right? And so when I was at a state coalition doing work, it was always about thinking, people didn't necessarily call for domestic violence, but maybe they called because they finally found someone that spoke Spanish. And even though they might have been experiencing domestic violence, needed help around immigration or around, access to services. And so while there may have been domestic violence, there were other things in their lives that really surfaced and were maybe things that they needed help around. And then eventually, after building the trust and the rapport, providers were able to work with folks around that. So intersectionality became something that we continued to talk about and include as part of this conversation because it was important. And then, of course, around people's different experiences with discrimination and oppression, and how it's, not one shoe fits all, right? People live complex experience, have and live complex experiences. So if we're thinking about servicing in a way that really changes lives and really makes a difference, we're thinking as providers, how do we engage folks around these different issues? So I think, when we think about, intersectionality, it's like not one survivor is going to come to us living one issue and that's it, right? So it could be an undocumented, non-speaking person experiencing domestic violence, and multiple levels of trauma, right? And so A, the trauma doesn't define them. B, they may not even want to talk about that, but if as providers, it's our goal to engage folks, right? We're going to meet them as humans, as people, and we're going to engage them around what's important until we gain their confidence and their trust, right? And so it is about believing their story. It is about believing their truth. And it's also not just talking about the trauma, not just talking about the violence, but engaging them with dignity, humility, and respect. And so, this for us was something that we lifted because it was very important as we thought about survivors seeking services, as providers as providers were shaping services. And I think it's so relevant in the time that we're living now. We've obviously, as providers and professionals, have moved into virtual spaces, and oftentimes we're thinking about how organizations now are thinking like, okay, so how do we provide these services? So it's really, for me, in these 11 or so weeks that we've been in quarantine, thinking about these intersectionalities, these issues and these factors and access, right? And so thinking about the level of access to services people had, moving services or interventions into virtual spaces, and as providers and organizations, what do we continue to do to make sure that people that are experiencing these different types of violence and trauma and abuse have access in a way that's respectful, that's equitable, and that is fair.
Thank you, Wendy. And as I'm weaving in a little bit more, and you are noticing how we started co-developing this curriculum, we also introduced a lot of the concepts of developmental trauma and complex trauma that are something that the NCTSN has tons of information. And through that, one of the pieces that I just want to share with you is that, the educational component and the tool that we were providing to the trainees was that the understanding that when children and adults endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, right? It's not just that it happened one time and it was done. Unfortunately, with domestic violence, what ends up happening is that people endure those traumatic events for years sometimes. That's very unfortunately, but that's the reality, right? So when that happens, they are especially people are especially likely to have multiple gaps in their development, right? These are for kids. And so the fascinating piece is that we definitely go over a bit more, but what I would like to share with you is that the fascinating piece is that the deep privilege of conducting these trainings is that you meet amazing and wise people. And in one of the trainings, the director of Boys and Girls of Bridgeport, Connecticut, he saw the drawing and he said, you know, we all here are today and we are becoming the bridges for those missing stairs. And that's something that resonated and stayed with me, and it will stay for much longer. And I think that, you know, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, I think that we all are here today because we want to unite forces, and we are actually part of this bridge, and we are making a difference. And if we, you know, continue helping one another, I think that that's the better impact that we will have, and the more support that our community will get. So with Train of Trainers, the important piece when you develop a curriculum, as you know, is how you make it interactive, right? And one of the pieces is that Think Trauma actually had interactive ways of engaging the trainees. And one of them is using a movie. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Freedom Riders, but that's an amazing movie that came out in the 2000s. And if you had not had a chance to watch it, I will encourage you to do it. It's based on it's based on a real story, and it talks about a teacher who met students who were coming from marginalized communities, and these students presented serious challenges. But this teacher was able to support them and be that bridge that I just showed you. And the kids were amazing. By the end of the school year, everybody graduated from high school. Some of them even went to college, and they are doing amazing things. So you pick little clips of the movie to make your points, and to make sure that the concepts and the definitions that you are trying to convey can be really illustrated and captured in these parts of the movie, which you know, for freedom riders, there is a lot of opportunities for that when it comes to trauma. And every time that we ran the training, there were a lot of things that were really important for us, and we were learning from our trainees. And one of them that touched my heart, even just talking about, is the importance of being present with a person with tons of pain, right? And also the importance of noticing your power, right? This teacher knew that, you know, she had some power, but she didn't misuse the power. As a matter of fact, with many of the activities that this teacher did with her students throughout the movie, you could see it. There were moments where the invitation was for her physically to even to sit down when the kids were standing up. So the kids will notice that she was waiting for them to make the first move and not for her to tell them what to do. That was something that, you know, even though I have watched the movie so many times, it was sort of a revelation when one of the trainees shared with us in one of our group discussions. And it was beautiful to see how things that you are trying to bring to more awareness in terms of how trauma impacts the lives of individuals, but also the groups and communities, we're really clicking and making sense to our audience and to our trainees. So the other piece that I really I enjoy seeing Wendy do a lot, and it's so great when she does it, is role plays. And it has great effects in groups, and she will further talk about it. And also, every training, everybody left with some action plan. So
Mhm.
we facilitated group discussions where everybody would know what to do after the training and who were the groups that they could possibly begin this educational use these educational tools with them. So here is Wendy talking about role play exercise.
Thank you, Rocio. So it was very interesting for us because, as Rocio mentioned, we were taking we were taking our professional experiences. We were all trainers and educators. We were involved with the Latino community, providing services or doing some administration around services, but it felt like, you know, there were things still missing, like we've been saying, when it came to really um, creating something for us, right? And so one of the things that was interesting, because as Rocio said, the curriculum that we had at the time that actually is no longer in use was Safe Family, Safe Home, which was a curriculum that was adapted, I think, in maybe 14 states. Connecticut was one of the first states where it was rolled out. And there was one exercise there that we had used with permission, and we had translated it we had it professionally translated in Spanish, and I forget exactly the name. I think it was the immersion exercise, but we used to do it with Spanish speaking professionals and providers, and it was like a hit. People loved it. And the exercise, the role play was the exercise was a role play around the experience of a survivor interacting with different systems, and the systems that were asking so many different things of the survivor. And so it was like the court, child's welfare, the church, the person that uses violence family, the survivor's family, the shelter staff. And so it was like 19 different either systems or people interacting. And the role play, that exercise would take about 45 minutes. And you know, we had done it enough where we understood it, but when we started really using it with Spanish speaking Latinos, it was like a hit. People were like, I remember there were times where people would invite us just to do that um, at you know, a training or something like that. And what that told us was that you know, as storytelling continues to be very important for many cultures, different Latino cultures as well, it was a good way to illustrate the life of a survivor in a way that was telling a story to providers. You know, unfortunately, sometimes we live and work in silos, and so to be able to have that role play, that we used it as a way to illustrate to folks that there's so many different ways that a situation can happen. There's so many different factors, there's so many decisions, but at the center of that is the family that's experiencing violence and the survivor and all the decisions that have to be made. So it's an older exercise, but we used it as a way to help us tell the story of a survivor, and it worked really well. And also to really continue the conversation around why it was important for providers that were working with Latino families to understand this. So the training was offered statewide several times in Connecticut for a couple of years. It was also offered um, in Puerto Rico um, through the Domestic Violence Coalition here. I'm in Puerto Rico now. And we were invited by Coordinadora Paz in 2017, right before Maria, to present to folks here on the island and in Spanish. And so by that time, we had already evolved and developed a manual, resources. So it was a complete train of trainers by the time that we came to Puerto Rico. And so we offered it again in Connecticut and Puerto Rico. Um, we have a couple of stats that we wanted to share in terms of like professional staff and who participated. We had advocates, social worker, counselors, students. We had, you know, nurses, aid, community advocates. You know, and this is actually not inclusive of everyone that attended. It's just to kind of give you a flavor. But we had folks that worked in like the army with families, you know, psychologists, professors. So it wasn't just for mental health folks or DV folks or folks that worked with trauma, but our goal was to really create something that was meaningful, that was respectful to the culture, or the different, rather, sorry, cultures within the Latino cultures, and that made sense for everyone. We offered it in English and Spanish. The last reiteration, is that even a word, was in Spanish. The materials were in Spanish. So they were mainly women professionals, and they were mainly people of 10 or more years of professional experience attending. And so when we asked folks what they learned after the training, some of the things that they took away were definitions, of course. So, and we knew right away that this wasn't like a DV 101 or a trauma 101. This was for folks that had some level of experience working either at the intersections of all these issues, or at least with one. And so people were learning how to safety plan, you know, strategies for working with Latinos. And another important, which you know, we're maybe speaking to the choir, but one of an important takeaway for us was that even though we had created this curriculum, it had to be adapted depending on where we were invited, right? And so in Connecticut, you know, we use the term Latinos, but in Puerto Rico, we're mostly all Spanish speaking folks. So it's not as relevant. And so issues, immigration looks issue in Puerto Rico versus continental US. And so those were things that we as trainers learned, because I have to say that even though we created this together, we learned just as much from folks as they learned from us. And so people were reported learning about barriers, about available resources, about collaboration, strategies for working, and really understanding the effects of mental health and domestic violence. And so we wanted to spend a couple of minutes. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I know we have, just trying to gauge here. So we one of the things that for us was really important, as Rocio kind of told us already, and for us it was really about understanding what collaboration was, because we were creating across mainstream organizations. And so there were similar goals that our organizations had, but maybe also not necessarily competing, but different priorities, right, for different organizations. And that depends on funding, on access, on so many different, the mission and the vision. And so to be able to talk a little bit more about this, there's something that's put out by the Tamarack Institute, and it's this idea that collaboration is a spectrum. And so oftentimes we're thinking, it's like, okay, that's what it looks like, and that's what I want to reach. And, you know, depending on whether we're providing services to all the family or some of the family, what type of services, you know, and what organization, what's our mission, what's our vision, how do we operate, it could be in fact an actual spectrum, right? And so understanding the other organizations, starting from a common place, and understanding that organizations are there has to be an incentive to collaboration, right? It's not just this authoritative, I want to collaborate with you because I want to send you folks, but really understanding that it's a two-way street. And so that's why we included this here, because there's different ways to work together And collaboration is absolutely, or collaborating on behalf of families is absolutely one of them, but it's not the end all be all. And sometimes it may be about coordinating services. It may be about working together and not reinventing the wheel, because this organization provides the family with this, and this organization provides the family with that. And so that's why we have that there. You know, for us, when we were creating, we could go on to the next slide, Rocio, thank you. For us, it was so important to build trust and relationships. And so because, and I can't speak for Paloma or Rocio, but because we were from mainstream organizations, we worked with Latino and Spanish speaking family, but sometimes we were known or not known to the actual Spanish speaking and Latino community. And so for us, it was about building trust. And sometimes that was attending meetings to support an event or to support something without us even, you know, having any clear kind of like benefit other than really being invested in building the trust and relationship with a person or organization, a community leader. You know, I can think in my mind so many times where we were really building relationships, particularly in Connecticut, with different organizations and different community leaders. Sometimes not necessarily things that you can qualify for. I don't even know how to explain it. So it's like, all right, you're collaborating, and that's why it's so important to understand the differences. But you're building trust with a community leader that's respected by the community, and they don't necessarily render services, but you better believe that when the community needs input and needs someone, they're going to go to that person. So we attended a lot of those things. Because it was important for us to continue to connect, to become more and more visible in order to be able to build and model, quite frankly, some of the things that we knew were important. And so really thinking about, we could go on to the next slide, but really thinking about, you know, meaningful partnerships. I think I've covered all of this. Like, are we coming together, understanding each other's mission and vision? Does everyone have access to services? You know, so depending on the size of the organization, is there the same access, you know, a state agency versus a smaller community organization? Do they have available data? Is there transparency? You know, is there development for staff? And I would say particularly staff of color, staff, you know, Spanish speaking staff, like whatever that you know, other agency has. Are there clear goals and things that define these things? And so for us, it was very important to understand that before we started. And this was a question, and it says chatbot questions, but we can just talk a little bit about it. But if we think about what organizations offered, even what your organization offered before the pandemic, you know, so what were some traditional barriers when we think about barriers and what gets in the way of services? And maybe not just for Latino families, but in general, and we're thinking about you know, marginalized communities, underserved communities, underrepresented communities, which Latino communities can, of course, fall under that. Well, what are some of those barriers, right? We think about transportation, lack of funding, lack of childcare, lack of, you know, all these things that can be barriers to services. And so the reason why we're surfacing some of this is because none of those barriers have necessarily left the families that need service and that need access, right? And so when we're thinking about building collaboration, trust, and it's like in my mind, I keep saying there's like pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. How, excuse me, how relevant is it now to continue to lift these things that were once barriers and really think about how the pandemic has affected some of that? So we could go on to the next slide, Rocio.
Wendy, I have some responses.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a response from Michelle Santiago, and she wrote stigma and seeking services. And also from Amanda, we have, I am an ESL teacher and I have a difficult time just getting access to my EL students. Teach them digitally when I'm not in the same building as them.
That's so great. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. And so that's so important, right? So it's like the barriers haven't disappeared, right? We're working in a world where we're trying to figure things out for the vulnerable communities and populations that we serve, right? We have this commitment. And so for us, really thinking about the needs of Latino communities and how that has shifted in the pandemic, and I use the word change here, but it's not that the others have gone away, but how has some of that shifted is really thinking about as an organization or as these answers that we got. So what did I do prior to this? But really doing a self-assessment of how you offered services and how the pandemic has affected the way that you offer these services, particularly in culturally responsive ways, right? And so how is your organization set up to continue building some of this? And so if you think about technology, knowledge of technology, not only for the providers and the staff, but for the families. If you're offering now services in in virtual spaces, what does that look like? Are we ensuring that they're getting the best service available right now? And of course, we're all trying to figure this out because we are in new spaces. We're really thinking about that. But I think that the onus comes from the provider, the organization, as we continue to do work with vulnerable communities. And so, thinking about, we already said that, so we could go on to the next. Really, how do, Rocio explained beautifully how we love, and I think we're all a little cabin fevered right now. We miss the physical touch, but for Latinos, I mean, we're typically very social. How does this change? How do we continue to engage in a meaningful way in different spaces, right? And so we kiss, we hug, we exchange personal stories before we provide the service. We bring a cafecito, we bring a flan, and so these were all things that were very important, but it's again up to us to continue to think about how do we cultivate connectedness in a place in the world right now where social isolation is the word of the day, right? And so again, organizations really thinking about how are we building knowledge of staff to virtually engage with families, or even if that is a possibility, because it may not be a Zoom call, it may be a phone call, it may be that we're helping support folks that have access to the family so that there's visibility there. So it's different ways to continue to engage in a meaningful way until we can figure this out. So we wanted to kind of, and as we wrap up today, we wanted to touch very quickly, not even sure if we'll have time to do this exercise, but we wanted to very quickly talk about self-care, right? And so we talk about it, it sounds good, but how are we really taking care of ourselves so that we can continue to do the work that we do? And so if we go on to the next slide, I want to say, I think we're actually going to skip over this exercise in the interest of time. And so what I want to say is here that yes, we encourage folks to manage their stress. Thank you. Manage their stress and think about it in a way that's meaningful today. But I think another thing, I was presenting at a webinar, but one of some of the conversation that we're hearing is people almost forcing productivity on folks, right? So really starting from a place of wellness is understanding that we're not always going to be as productive, that there is going to be days that we're clouded, that there are going to be days that we need to take breaks now more than ever. And actually, when we used to do this curriculum, I love that Rocio would always say this. Self-care is not about doing it 20 minutes once a week. It's about finding little ways to do it every single day. And if that message is not more important now, I don't know when it is, right? So finding ways to breathe. Yes, just sitting down and breathing and taking fresh air. If you're able to go on a walk, if you're able to separate so that you can connect again, that it's just being able to take care of yourselves, right? And so doing it in a wonderful but very personal way, I think is and consistent way is very important. And so really thinking about our physical and our emotional responses, one of the things that we're sharing now is like, it's okay if you have cloudy days. It's okay if, you know, you don't want to, or you're not producing at the same rate, or it's okay for you not to build a side business now. I've heard so many different things. It's okay to be and to take care of yourself, especially for folks that are providers and have traditionally been the helpers, right? And so we cannot do that if we don't do it ourselves. And we all have heard this for many webinars and trainings and years, but now it's more important than ever to breathe, to practice yoga, to spend time with family, to breathe, to meditate. There's so many different ways and so many different resources in order to be able to separate to then now do the work for folks that we do that could be so difficult.
And if I might add, go ahead.
Sorry, now that I have a few responses, like
Okay.
Yolanda Chalco, overeating, trying to stay busy, over and under sleeping. From Michelle Santiago, yes, balance is important on a daily basis. We can help others if we can't help ourselves.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And so, you know, we've been saying these in different spaces, but really like checking in, like in the mornings, just checking in, knowing who is part of your little, you guys remember the Rolodex? Who's part of your like your social connections that you can count on? Just bounce something off. It might not be people that you're physically with, but you know, someone that you can just text or call and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes? Just want to run something by you. So now more than ever, these things are so important. And we just encourage folks, not now, but just always to do it, but especially now, which was one of the things that we, of course, included in the curriculum when we first developed it. So I will leave the rest of our time to Rocio to talk a little bit about resilience.
Thank you, Wendy. And if I might add about self-care, I think that for Latinos, many times we have to encourage us to do group care. Whenever we think about caring for the group, I think that we start thinking about how we care for ourselves too. So if that works for you, by all means, practice it.
Thank you.
Sure. So when we talk about resilience and collaborative work, I think that that's one of my favorite topics. I think that in Spanish there is a phrase that it says, una pena entre dos es menos atroz. And sometimes it's very hard to translate things literally from one language to another because it doesn't really resonate so well. But it's more the idea of how many times when you have something that in this case what we share with you, a desire to do something meaningful for our communities, and when you try to do it by yourself, many times it can be very overwhelming. But when you do it in a group, in a group that you trust, in a group that you feel comfortable with, then many wonderful things can come out of it, and that definitely helps with resiliency, right? It makes you feel that you're not alone. It makes you feel that you can count on people, and it actually helps you to feel more fulfilled. So collaborative work, I think, is one way that we can all feel that sort of empowerment that also contributes with resiliency. And for Latinos, this really resonates very well, since we come from a very collective view of how we relate to each other and to the world in general. And one of the favorite phrases is "La unión hace la fuerza." It's in unity that you empower yourself, and that's that's what I had seen. I had seen that in the worst times, there are always people who come and support you. And in the worst time, the best of us many times comes out. So I would leave you with that. We are very spiritual. We are group oriented. You know, we are believers. We focus on our families. We have wonderful friends who also support us. So there is a whole sort of village that we value so much, and that village, even though we cannot right now get physically connected, there are many number of ways, like Wendy said, that we still are very much connected, and we still are very much counting with each of them. So we will leave it with that, and I will pass it on to Isa. Thank you so much, really, for participating. We really, really appreciate you signing in for this webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everyone for your participation. We have a few questions. If you want to send us a question, we can read it to our presenters. We have a question about what is Marianismo?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So, you know, in the Latino culture, Marianismo is very much related with the Virgin Mary, and how she seems like a figure of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, and looking out for her family, her community, and very sort of conducting her life on her core beliefs and based on her faith. And when we think about women, and this is something very traditional, we think about women in the households as women who sacrifice, they self-sacrifice a lot in order to make sure that that their families are okay, and that in order to make sure that they are constantly taking care of their needs. So that's where the word Marianismo comes in.
And we have a question also from Ramona Arechiga. How the situation with the government has affected our Latino population, racial, social, and health. I am in a small community where is a low Latino population. How these problems are handled in the big cities.
So I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure. You know what the question is. It sounded more like a statement, but I do have to say that you know, we talked a little bit about what were the barriers and what were the issues pre-pandemic. So really thinking about those didn't necessarily go away. And so, in fact, sometimes they may be even highlighted because of the pandemic, right? So if you're thinking about, this person is saying there's not a lot of Latinos in their communities, so that maybe it's an assumption, but we can maybe say that there may have been limited access to some services for folks that speak Spanish primarily, right? And so really thinking about that in the world and that we're living now, post-COVID, what does that mean for folks that need services and even be mandated into services with lack of services available, physical services available. So really, I think, you know, part of it is for organizations to be respectful, culture specific, creative, and innovative when possible. You know, organizations are made up by humans and people that have their own, you know, fears and things, especially now, but I think it's a start.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. We have one question for each of you that Ileana Martinez made. So I'm going to start with Rocio and then Wendy. For Rocio, it says getting to know a family member, etc., I, as a Puerto Riqueña, agree with this, but the reality of professional ethical codes, this could be seen as a violation. And she's talking about the need for a more personal approach. So how do we offer this culturally accessible possibility of rapport without being considered unethical?
That's a great point. Thank you so much for raising this wonderful point. That's when I think that collaborative work has really worked for me, and working with grassroots organizations and working as part of the group really helps me not to cross some of the boundaries that otherwise ethically, from an academic setting, I might be crossing. So that's my the first way that I do it. There are, when I was working with NAMI and the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I had opportunities where I could do referrals, where I knew that there were different interactions that were fostered that I was not able to foster in my office. But also the other aspect is that, as a Latino professional, I'm also a Latino member of my community. So there are opportunities where the identity of the professional psychologist, I leave it in my office. So whenever I have different interactions in my community, I'm also a part of the community as a member and as an advocate and as other different roles. So that's another way that I do it.
Thank you, Rocio. And for me, I second everything Rocio said. And in fact, we actually used to carve out time and space to meet outside of our offices because it was important to connect both formally but also informally, right? And so my response is everything that Rocio said, and also really asking folks to look at their practice and policies, right? And so maybe looking at where there's opportunities for you to advocate, right, for the need for things to change maybe a little bit, or to have more space to meet with folks in a more not even culturally specific, but in a way that feels more authentic, yes, professional, but also that you can connect, because that's important. At the end of the day, it's important to connect with the folks that we serve, right? Because we're humans, we're all humans, and it could very well be us or one of our family members at the receiving end. At least that's the way I think. And so, yes, thinking about policy practice that are progressive and that have opportunities for us to really think about things a little bit differently, and then folks advocating for that, right? And so if the need is to meet, in non-traditional hours, or even so why would you advocate for that? Spending some time and even doing a little bit of research, and perhaps having folks, leadership and management, see things a little bit differently. So collaboration, partnerships. I love what Rocio said, being actually invested in the community. And of course, you don't have to be part of the community to care for the community. We all know that. And so if there's issues that are important to you, really showing up as a human being, as a part of a community, I think is so helpful, even if you are the minority in that setting, just to give you some ways to really think about how do we connect in a way that's respectful but very meaningful. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Thanks. So we have another question from Amanda Shrewin. Sorry if I spelled the name wrong. How do we balance prioritizing academics from our Latino students and their own community and linguistic needs?
That's an important one. Okay, so as an ESL person too, that started actually learning English at 19 years old, I think that, you know, they go hand in hand, because you actually need to feel okay and feel that you belong to a group in order for the academics also to sink in, and in order for you to be able to emotionally regulate a lot of the things that happen to you as a result of being in a new environment, right? So point one is that, how we can help students to feel more comfortable, to understand that it is a process, but also for them to feel welcome, and that they feel part of the group in the academic work, so they can really they can actually feel that they have their own space, and they can open up, right? I think that there are really wonderful opportunities of cultural exchange, and also wonderful opportunities to learn from one another. So one quick example is, you know, as ESL student, you know, I benefit a lot from being part of a university setting where I had to listen and I had to learn a lot about the new norms, right, of the academic setting that I was part of. And so I benefit a lot, but I also think that my academic setting benefit a lot from what I was also bringing. And I was bringing myself. And when I bring myself, I cannot leave my Latino roots aside, right? And that's the beautiful part. And I think that the more spaces that we create where we can exchange these sort of different ways that we see the world and the ways that we interact the world, the more that academics with cultural practice will also be part of the whole system.
Okay. Thank you. We have it is a comment and also a question from Cindy Bello. How can I be trained to provide the trauma curriculum? This will benefit not only the population I serve, but also the staff I supervise. All services are offered in Spanish.
Wow. So let's talk. You have my email. I know in the handouts, and you have Wendy email. So we can actually reach out to us, and we will be able to share the information.
That's great. Bridget Rivera, my experience is from small community where there is fear of ICE coming in and taking members of families. So traumatic for the whole family. This has been a barrier of Latino culture opening up due to the lack of trust from people wanting to help. What suggestions do you have for these families or ways to work with them?
So, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that unless you want to, Rocio.
No, Wendy, go ahead.
It's, that's a really great question. And so it was very relevant also as we developed this curriculum. And as an advocate myself, having worked with survivors in those situations, it can be very, very frustrating because you want to help, right? And so I think the question speaks to how do you build capacity at one end, and also how do you continue to connect with the families that experience this. And I know that, for instance, when we came to Puerto Rico, we had those conversations. And so for us, a starting place and a place and something that we learned as we rolled this out and trained was that there's very fears that the families have. So centering, right, services around the very real needs of the family. At the same time, building capacity, because it is a skill set, right? So building capacity internally for folks to be able to respond work, and also recognize when they may not be the most, I shouldn't say the most appropriate, but perhaps the person that's gonna help that family go on to the next level, right? And so there's not one person has all the answers, but I think, you know, in like, if I could answer this in 1 minute, is yes, center services and center interventions around the family, they will tell you. They will tell you. So they're their own experts and we follow them. We're here to support them. And at the same time, build capacity. And for me, building capacity is not just a one and done training, but also kind of like commit to this, especially if it's something that's very relevant in your area, in terms of capacity internally, resources that are available, folks that your organization has collaborated with and can call if you're in a bind, and really thinking about what does that look like in this pandemic, right? And so really thinking about that, I think, is the quickest way that I can answer that.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Wendy and Rocio. So thank you all for attending to this webinar, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.